There are immense cash flows coming to the state, which was a surprise to me. I, like a lot of us, thought that we were going to be looking at a recession, and instead, thanks to immense numbers of dollars that are causing a different kind of a problem, dumped into the economy by the Fed and by the federal government, we have tremendous cash flows right now. And I think, first of all, this is a moment when we've had immense tax increases. We should mitigate those. In fact, I think that we should repeal some of those. At the same time, we have demands on our transportation system. And I think almost no other route to solving those than to use some of these major cash flows that are coming through the general funds budget. And we should spend those on our transportation infrastructure. If you care about the rural economy, if you care about the urban economy, understand that we all depend on goods and services that are able to move around the state and around the country. And the gas tax, first of all, is as regressive as it can get in terms of its impact on working families. And second of all, it came in for three last session. There were two immense bills that over the long term are going to have tremendous inflationary impacts on the cost of fuel, and we can't depend on a gas tax anymore. So let's use those dollars to increase road capacity. And I'm a Republican, but I would also say let's use them for the smartest impacts when it comes to public transportation as well. Most of us agreed directionally that we needed to improve the relationship between police and the people that they most commonly interact with. Anybody with eyes saw that there was tragedy resulting sometimes in bad cops, other times in lack of understanding of proper tactics. But I also think last year was the very worst year that we could have done this, because the public input and the input from the police was too easy to ignore. It's true that they probably set records for the number of people that testified, but a lot of those people testified in 30-second blocks. That's quantity of public input. It's not quality of public input. I talked to many police and law enforcement officers and organizations that didn't testify because they were afraid of retaliation. That's not a way to have a proper process, and it's not the way to have a good result. It's true, one of the organizations supported the bills. All the other police organizations that I'm aware of did not support the bills. It is really good that the people that supported these bills in the first place, the members of the House and Senate, are acknowledging that there are improvements, in some cases major improvements that need to be made. But there was a price to pay for people and families. Tragedy ensued in part because these bills went too far. And I think that the lack of process, the lack of face-to-face contact, and especially the fact that we were in an atmosphere where people didn't feel like they could fully share their experience, meant that we had tragically flawed bills. And I'm glad that there's going to be fixes. By the way, I think every single one of the fixes that are going to be implemented could have been implemented last year via amendments that were offered and rejected. I had a pretty important to me interview with Matt Driscoll on that day, and I would invite any of you that wonder what I thought then to go take a look at that. And I wouldn't take a single word back. Matt Driscoll from the News Tribune is who I mean. I'm going to give you a little bit of a long answer here. Speaker Jenkins and I were on the phone earlier that morning, and I don't watch much national news. She mentioned what was happening, and I quickly checked my Twitter feed, and she said that she was going to go into Olympia that day, and I just felt like it was important that both she and I be there. It wasn't a partisan thing. It wasn't because I thought she needed protection. I just thought we should both be standing up in our offices and saying that we're going to continue government as it should be in the state of Washington. I also said I thought threatening people was un-American. We've had protests, we've had riots, but I think that we were on the knife's edge of even greater disaster that day. And if a recognized leader would have been available, that person, might have been killed. And no life is more important than the other, but the symbolism of something like that in terms of our structure of government would be devastating. And the other thing that I said about that day was that this will destroy us all unless we're willing to use whatever influence that we have. Say that's not the way we do things here. I was able to watch what was happening at the Capitol out my window. I applaud. There was a fairly young state patrol woman on the porch of the governor's mansion, and she didn't leave. She stayed there and asked people to behave peaceably. And they, for the most part, did. They didn't, I don't think that they threatened her. They certainly didn't go into the governor's mansion. But I also know that there was at least one member of the press in the back of the group that was mistreated. And we can't have that either. We all depend on a free press here. And we depend on a diversity of opinions. And we have to stand up for that as well. Representative Maycomer from the House Republicans has concentrated for several years on how can, if we want to have a really good public safety and law enforcement community, you have to recruit great people and you have to recruit a diverse workforce. Her bills have concentrated on that. The fact that we've allowed law enforcement to be demonized to the extent makes it even harder to have the most effective people want to have that career. First of all, I don't think there's anything more regressive on working families than the cost of fuel. And things that happened last year, immense increases in the cost of carbon, which of course turned into the cost of fuel and the cost of commuting for people that want to live where they can afford to live and have to work because of the way the economy develops long distances away. So let's make a huge change by figuring out how we can fund transportation in the future. Not by doing it with a road tax of some kind. Let's use those dollars to build a transportation system of the future and not depend on hard-pressed working families and commuters to do that. And one other thing, we've got this tax we've already mentioned hanging over our head. That is the long-term health care tax that has been delayed for some time. And, sometimes there is an important problem and there are great ideas. And when you run the numbers, they just don't work. We know that 25% of the payroll in the state of Washington is already opted out. Every fix that is being contemplated doesn't add any revenue to that system. It adds additional cost and vests people more quickly. I don't think that it's going to be sustainable financially. Why don't we get rid of it and replace it with something that is a partnership with the private sector? Representative Stokesbury is working on a bill that would repeal it and then replace it with something that actually works. I think that would be a pretty good approach to providing tax relief as well. It has taken many, many years to get into this. And part of the problem is we've demonized some kinds of housing. We've said you can't build here, but you have to build there. We've had bills almost every year that make it almost impossible to own a manufactured housing development. I'm all in favor of making zoning much more simple, but you can't just do that in the densest places. Somebody earlier mentioned that housing costs were at a record high in Okanagan County. Well, that's because it's almost impossible or it's very difficult and very time consuming, very expensive to build in places where, there's not any kind of overcrowding at all. And so I think the first step that we have to take is pause these building code changes. Those add an immense amount to the cost of housing, and it also reduces the options that people have to keep themselves warm and cook their food and all those things. And we have to decide we're not going to limit this only to transportation corridors. There's a ton of rural employers, for example, now that are struggling because they don't have a workforce that can find housing next to them. So we could actually take people off the streets if we would allow housing around rural areas where they have a workforce challenge as well. We have demonized so many different segments of housing. That has to end, and that's what's got us into the place that we are right now. I've heard last night there's a 250,000 unit shortage of housing in the state of Washington. For $1 billion, you can build about 2,500 public housing units. That's 100 years. This is going to take the private sector, partnerships, and the public sector.